Hello, my darling listeners. It's me, Fax 5'em. Here I am. Honestly, I really can't think of a rather silly way to try to introduce this, because I'm finally talking about the one and only Benjamin Ryan Pitchfork Tillman. If you've listened to any of my recent videos, one name that has appeared time and time again is none other than Benjamin Ryan Tillman, also known as Pitchfork Ben. This long-dead man is the bane of my existence. There's only one word that can properly describe that man: evil. He was a man made of pure hatred and a little bit of water. A man who led violent insurrections against the Reconstruction-era government of South Carolina. A man who encouraged and took part in lynch mobs. And the man who may as well have written the current Constitution of South Carolina. If you've ever watched Ken Burns' documentary on Teddy Roosevelt, you may have actually heard of him, even if you've forgotten his name. When Teddy Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to be the first black man to attend a White House dinner, Pitchfork Ben that he and his white buddies would have to kill 1,000 of those ends to get them back in their place. Quite a charming individual, you can see. Of course, that didn't stop him from amassing quite a following that, despite having taken over just about every lever of power in the state in the name of the common people, didn't really accomplish much that benefited said common people. I like to call this impotent Tillmanite rage. As Tillman fed the flames of rage and resentment, he fanned them as they metaphorically and literally destroyed countless lives of recently freed African Americans, and then did, honestly, next to nothing. You'd assume that literally rewriting the constitution of his state would bring about great changes, but all it did was go out of its way to make life worse, not only for African Americans, but many of the poor whites who backed his rise to power in the first place. This paper is not about the vile hatred in Tillman's soul, though. This paper is about his rhetorical style, and holy heck, it just seemed to get more and more relevant the further I read into it. When I recorded this, there's honestly times when I tried and failed to hold back laughter. I kept one of them in because I kind of liked the way it sounded. This is the second take of this article, in which I finally found the full version. Hooray! Basically, I just add on the parts that I couldn't find in the original one. Enjoy! Pitchfork Ben Tillman and the Emergence of Southern Demagoguery by E. Culpeper Clark, published in the Quarterly Journal of Speech, edition 69, in the year 1983. Demagogue is a slippery word that, like populace, loses its original power of definition through broad application. Rather than teacher or leader of the people, the word connotes one who panders to emotions and prejudices of the baser sort. In common parlance, a demagogue is one who whips up passion for the wrong side. The recent publication of The Oratory of Southern Demagogues raises anew the question of how historians of rhetoric should use the concept of demagoguery and provides interpretive keys for attaching meaning to the term. Appropriately cautious in generalizing, the editors still identify three traits of the Southern demagogue. First, they were arrogant men whose rhetoric often reeked of omniscience. Second, they were felicitous promoters who often appeared more interested in the seductive power of promised reforms than the issues themselves. Finally, they practiced a highly domineering discourse that, despite some political value in one party's states nonetheless, tended to stifle any constructive exchange of ideas. These traits serve a valuable descriptive purpose and provide keys for identifying important features in the discourse. But they do not seem necessarily to move us closer to what makes figures like James K. Vardaman or Eugene Talmadge uniquely demagogues or Southern other than by region. Both of these individuals were in their day notable Southern politicians. Eugene Talmadge, according to his Wikipedia page, was the governor of Georgia from 1933 to 1937, and then 1941 to 1943. He was actually elected for a fourth term in 1946, but he died before he could be inaugurated. According to his wiki page, it says, he is known for having actively promoted segregation and white supremacy and for advocating for racism in the university system of Georgia. James K. Vardaman was the governor of Mississippi, as well as a senator from Mississippi. A rather interesting mishmash of politics. Well, Vardaman's tenure as governor of Mississippi was marked by his advocacy of regulating corporations, enacting child labor laws, segregating streetcars, ending educational opportunities for African Americans, and defending lynching. Truth be told, at some point I might want to talk more about this unusual man, but, well, this guy uses a lot of slurs, like, a lot. So that'll be kind of tricky. Although this omission may have occurred consciously through the editor's laudable decision to allow each orator to stand on his own historical terms, nonetheless, I intend to use the case of Benjamin Ryan Tillman in order to make an argument which generalizes the nature of Southern demagoguery. Such an undertaking requires an acknowledgement that the term demagogue is one of judgment. There can be no restoration of its etymological purity. It is an epithet applied by one group operating from certain ideological assumptions to leading advocates of another group differently disposed. As such, it lends itself to the schoolyard tu quoque, so's your old man. This outsider-insider phenomena must be accounted for in any assessment of demagoguery. Before stating the method to be used, a general estimate is needed of what constitutes a Southern demagogue, as that term is used in this essay. At the very least, those to whom the term applies should be understood as men coping with the vicissitudes of a clearly defined era in the South's history. Southern demagoguery traces its origins to the 1880s and the aftermath of Reconstruction, at which time the unsettling effects of an industrializing nation on a regional and agrarian economy were most keenly felt. For the next 3 generations, demagogues strutted the political stage until World War II and telecommunications mandated a new style. All that remained was a shrill echo of the old style and the racial politics of the 50s and 60s, until an assassin's bullets struck George Wallace and silenced the echo itself. Now the Southern demagogue is something to be remembered, often wistfully, as good old boys turned essayists announce that one of the more notable aspects of the South's assimilation into America's corporate civilization has been the vanishing of all those splendidly gargoylish, uproarious old razorback demagogues of the South's age of tribal politics. The Vardamans, the Longs, the Tillmans, the Ross Barnetts. But sentiment for the glandular South should not observe the reputation these men carved in their time. They were outsiders who became insiders but could not assimilate their new status and remained forever strangers in a familiar land. At least 3 factors conspired to keep them outside even when they had gained access to the machinery of state. First, their constituents who reveled in their rhetoric discovered little change in their own status. As outcasts in the new industrial order, access to political power for them became more an opiate than a cure. Small farmers, small merchants, and mill workers who remembered being small farmers swelled the crowds but could not shake Roosevelt's designation that they and their region were the nation's #1 economic problem. Second, the same president who recognized their plight also symbolized the fact that the power to do something about misery was federal, not state. Thus, a group of men were swept into powerless positions by the powerless. Unable to alter the material facts, these men continued to do what they did best, to alter the psychological facts of life. The third factor keeping them outside and central to this essay was impoverishment of another sort. To wit, Southern demagogues seemed singularly without ideological moorings. Certainly, outside the liberal democratic mainstream and its conservative counterpart, these voices of the Southern populace were equally absent the cooperative democratic vision articulated by the genuine populists. Thus, without any ideological base from which to mount offensive rhetorical strategies, they found themselves on the defensive, pitting local interests against each other or retreating to the politics of race. The Southern demagogue then found himself in the van of the popular movement, but with no ideological home to which his people might be led. These 3 points caught my attention when I first read through them. Like most demagogues, Tillman did very little to actually change the lives of his supporters, at least not for the better. His supporters, by and large, did not really see much of anything that benefited them in terms of their actual status. A bit of context. South Carolina was one of 2 states, the other being Mississippi, which reported a majority enslaved population in the 1860 census, the last one prior to the Civil War. Since such a massive amount of South Carolina's economy was built upon enslaved labor, the Civil War completely and utterly annihilated the entirety of the state's economy, or at least the vast majority of it. Perhaps in an earlier time, the state could have recovered more easily, but the burgeoning Industrial Revolution was gradually making the old yeoman way of life simply less viable than it used to be. Tillman ranted and raved and railed about how he wasn't going to sell out to the New England industrialists and railroad barons, and when he died, well, South Carolina was still a poor-as-all-heck state. In one book I have on the man, it said that on his deathbed he gave some money to one of his sons and told him to go out west to Oregon and make his fortune there, as there just weren't any opportunities in South Carolina. And just imagine that for a second. Imagine being the literal son of the governor turned senator, and your state is so broke that your daddy can't find a nice cushy job for you. Yeah, that's how effed up it was. The second point builds on the first one. Perception is reality, and as long as the people perceive that you're fighting for their best interests, they'll support you, I guess. Tillman was one of the richest men in the state. His brother was literally a congressman, and yet the common poor whites saw him as one of their own. How does that work? Well, I guess he was a farmer, as the article does point out. He did actually put the effort into experimenting with new crops and probably had no issue getting his hands dirty in the field, I guess. With sprawling estates like his, I can't speak for how much of the actual labor he did, though. But the third part brings it all home. The part where the demagogue had no real political ideology. The only thing the Tillman movement had under its belt was complete and utter rage. Well, rage and hatred, I guess, but they're kind of close enough. As the article will later point out, Tillman lacked just about any concrete proposals or plans. He just railed against how the system benefited blacks and elites at the expense of hard-working whites. You weren't supposed to understand what the heck the movement wanted. You were just supposed to already kinda know it. In developing this thesis of ideological alienation, the reader is justified in detecting a debt owed to the turn historiography took in the 50s and 60s, especially that treating the abolitionists and their intellectual confrontation with the dismantling effects of Jacksonian democracy on American institutions. As with all parallels, caution is in order, and the experience of the abolitionists will be used only to illuminate the conditions that gave rise to a new, more democratic rhetoric in the post-Civil War South. What ultimately breaks down this parallel is the key to understanding what makes Benjamin Ryan Tillman a demagogue, while someone like Wendell Phillips is honored as a freedom fighter and professional reformer. Wendell Phillips, according to his Wikipedia page, lived from 1811 to 1844. He was an abolitionist, an advocate for Native Americans, an orator, and an attorney. From his wiki page, according to George Lewis Ruffin, a black attorney, Phillips was seen by many blacks as the one white American wholly colorblind and free from race prejudice. Yeah, honestly, that guy, he currently doesn't strike me as a demagogue, he strikes me as hella based. By applying insights from this scholarship to Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who was precursor of the Southern demagogue both in time and style, I hope to show not only how a demagogue emerges, but why this emotionally laden term becomes redundant with the class of popular Southern politicians described by Logue and Dorgan. The Emergence of Tillman. In Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the South got not only its first demagogue of the post-Civil War era, but its archetype as well. Like most popular leaders, he was not cut from the common cloth of the folk he led. Well educated by the standards of his day, he owned and farmed considerable acreage in Edgefield County, South Carolina. And by the time he moved center stage in 1885, he could at least be listened to as the brother of Congressman George D. Tillman. Most people thought his principal liability was not having fought in the war, but though willing, his youth, he was 17 when the war ended, and an accident which left him blind in one eye kept him at home. He would earn captain's bars, however, in the struggle to overthrow Reconstruction as white South Carolinians organized themselves into military companies, called themselves Red Shirts, and followed their military hero, Wade Hampton, in a bloody campaign to throw the rascals out. Ironically, it was Reconstruction and its violent overthrow that set the stage for Tillman's later movement. Historians have long credited the radicals of Reconstruction with importing democracy into the state. The Constitution of 1868 broadened the suffrage, increased the power of the electorate over office holders, and committed the state to educating its citizens. Unfortunately, the foresight of blacks, scalawags, and carpetbaggers went for naught, at least as far as blacks were concerned, when federal troops marched out of Columbia in 1877 and abandoned the state to its white masters. There is a footnote here for an upcoming word, namely the word conservative. The footnote reads, in using the terms conservative, conservative regime, or conservative democratic with a big D, I am following the usage of the time. In the late days of Reconstruction and the early days of Redemption, South Carolinians steered clear of the label democratic with a big D, for it still smacked of treason, and used the term conservative instead. Also, quote-unquote redemption is what the locals referred to the post-Reconstruction time, the idea being that they were redeeming their state and taking it back for the proper white masters. Oy fucking vey. They even spoke the language of racial conciliation and accommodation, but by enlisting the shock troops of redemption and by winking at the violence of their minions, Wade Hampton and his lieutenants sowed the dragon's teeth of their own undoing. The conservative redeemers tried to rule by racial accommodation, but their followers would not be made equals of a race that kept them at least one rung from the bottom. The shock troops of redemption figured that if the new democracy and white supremacy were not compatible, given the black majority in South Carolina, then they would keep the democracy and throw out the blacks, even if the old ruling elite had to go with their former slaves. The beginning of the end of the conservative regime in South Carolina started in 1885 and was heralded by a call from the upcountry Greenville News for a quote-unquote New Deal in state politics. 8 years had passed since the ouster of the radicals, and appeals for white solidarity behind the old leadership seemed less imperative. Moreover, by this time, Francis Warrington Dawson, editor of the powerful Charleston-based News and Courier, had emerged as the Warwick of South Carolina politics, much as Henry Grady was becoming in Georgia. Amidst calls for a New Deal, and with Dawson, a non-office holder, pulling the strings on state government, Ben Tillman made his first appearance. The occasion was the summer convocation of the State Grange and the State Agricultural and Mechanical Society, a gathering which, as usual, was to attract intelligent and representative farmers. The customary essays on fertilizer, grape culture, and tobacco planting were dutifully attended, but a storm was about to take the Bennettsville meeting, and as in most storms, little advance warning was given. All that the farmers knew was that the brother of Congressman Tillman was rumored to have something unusual to say. On the second day of the conversation, after being assured by the Commissioner of Agriculture that farmers were not growing poorer, though they did not prosper as they should, the sweat-soaked assembly was greeted by a long and rambling speech containing many hard truths mingled with a great deal of dry humor. For the first time, these farmers were not being addressed by a state chemist, a commissioner, or some professor. Like them, Tillman was a farmer whose appearance was a mixture of the plain and the uncouth, and whose one eye flashed ominously. After the typical self-effacing apologies of a speaker who must assert his humble origins, Tillman launched into an arraignment of the traditional evils of the Southern farm system and a not-so-traditional charge that politicians and lawyers in the pay of finance were the root of the problem. He flailed the South Carolina College for ignoring the farmers' needs while using their money to train lawyers and scholars whom Tillman equated with drones and vagabonds. He scolded the farmers for allowing themselves to be duped and told the story of the poor farmer who finally made it to the state legislature, only to emerge a year later a politician, the contract with General this and Judge that and Colonel something else, having awed and corrupted him. Tillman concluded with a call for resolutions aimed at improving the education and the representation of farmers. Though 4 of his 5 resolutions failed to pass, Tillman left Bennettsville confident that the farmers did the listening, the politicians the voting, and that explains why the resolutions failed to pass. After all, he had not gone there to pass resolutions, but to explain to the farmers how they are duped and robbed. During the next 5 years, Tillman would hone the approach taken at Bennettsville into a successful rhetorical strategy of mass appeal. He had an intuitive understanding of the requirements for successful agitation in the newly emerging Southern democracy. Tillman constantly baffled his enemies. Every move he made seemed sure to be counterproductive, yet his popularity only grew. Employing the sting of negative altercasing, he abused his followers to their face, calling them ignorant, imbecilic, backward, apathetic, and foolish. He assailed his enemies with a tongue so outrageous that many believed only the demise of the Code Duello kept him alive. He never won a factual dispute, at least as far as the state's press was concerned, and he seemed to have no real program beyond the establishment of a separate agricultural college, which he proved willing to lay aside if there were serious cost objections, and the call for a reorganization of the state agricultural department. All the other issues he raised from time to time were either not uniquely his own or were pushed with whatever inconsistency seemed demanded by the occasion. Despite all this, his movement grew and multiplied, thriving best when the issues appeared contrived, contradictory, or without foundation. This last bit I read is one of the first pieces of Tillman lore that I was truly familiar with. I say this because it's quoted on Ben Tillman's Wikipedia page. Actually, it's the paragraph that got me interested in this monster in the first place. This was back in 2015, 2016, or whenever, seeing old Donnie act like a fool, not making any coherent or factual sense, and yet his fans loved him. It honestly made just no sense to me, at all. I wondered if there had been any previous cases of this type of thing, and somehow I eventually stumbled upon this. It's weird seeing an article from the 1980s describing people in the 1880s having literally the exact same type of confusion that I had in the mid-2010s. Some things never change, I guess. Tillman was learning in the emerging Southern democracy what Northern abolitionists discovered in the wake of Jacksonian democracy. That reform was not a matter of devising programs, but nursing grievances. Tillman was becoming a non-programmatic radical, a label Robert D. Marcus attached to Wendell Phillips. Absent a program, he had nothing to defend and everything to attack. By denigrating his followers in the most outlandish terms, he not only made them laugh, but more importantly, engendered a sense of helplessness, made them feel powerless before the dominant class. In denouncing the Agricultural Society and the Department of Agriculture, he left little doubt that existing institutions were of no consequence in the solution of the ills which beset the farmer. Slowly but surely, Tillman was transforming the impotence of the farmer to achieve his goals into a condemnation of the social order which allowed him no avenue in which to do it. Existing institutions were buttressed by lawyers, merchants, and politicians. What was needed was for the 76% of the population who tilled the soil to assume control of these institutions, and reform would flow like water from a spring. Tillman needed no program, he needed grievances, and there were enough of those around to fuel a Midianite war of extermination between us and them, just as the social ferment of the 1830s and 1840s forced a group of American reformers to devise ways of responding to the vicissitudes of public opinion. So too did the breakup of conservative regimes in the South following Reconstruction invite new strategies for reaching people. The principal difference between the two lay not at the level of strategy, but at the governing assumptions, the rhetorical vision of the abolitionist being magnified by what Gunnar Myrdal styled the American creed, while the Southern demagogue was tied to the millstone of white supremacy. But at the level of strategy, as strategy had to respond to the participants in the new democracy, there remained an important kinship between the abolitionist and the popular Southern orator. Both realized, as Phillips put it, that agitation is an important, nay, an essential part of the machinery of the state. And what was required was a new kind of reformer, in fact, a professional reformer. Applying the strategy. Tillman's understanding of the strategic requirements of agitation is clearly illustrated in his relationship to Francis Waring Dawson, the man Joe Williamson called the political cat's paw of the conservative regime. Unfortunately, none of the works on Tillman in South Carolina have examined the rhetorical implications in the correspondence between Tillman and Dawson, nor what that exchange reveals about Tillman's application of a rhetorical strategy. As editor of the Charleston News and Courier, Dawson was to South Carolina what Henry Grady was to Georgia, a political kingmaker. Dawson became a kingmaker in part because he was a skilled manipulator of competing interests. He identified himself with no particular faction and alienated none. He became restive only when he perceived the revered Wade Hampton and his followers to be ruling by right of their gray eminence rather than by dint of political vision and action. And when Tillman burst upon the scene, he did not take the farmer for granted. Like many other conservatives, Dawson conceded the grounds for grievance and most of the farmers' demands. Dawson's strategy, if it could be called that, for he did not think he had anything to fear, was to convince the antagonist that there was plenty of room for change within the system. At first, Tillman proved receptive to Dawson's sympathetic overtures, but with the same instinct that made him a radical without a program, he soon understood that the editor could kill him with kindness. He was beginning to see the repressive side of tolerance and to realize that the fortunes of his movement depended far more on resistance than acceptance by the established interests. Over the next year, Dawson moved the News and Courier into overt support for the separate agricultural college idea and struck up a correspondence with Tillman designed to draw Tillman into the fold. Expressing some dismay that the movement seemed to have gone far and away beyond its original purposes, Dawson still could not bear the idea that any two men who want to do good in South Carolina should get apart or stay apart. Tillman proved to be equally adroit, laying the responsibility for some strange somersaulting on Dawson's subordinates while the editor had been in Europe. Tillman then averred that he told his supporters that Dawson is away, and I will not believe he will fight me when he gets back. Out of this polite fencing came an agreement that the two should meet, and after some negotiating about location, Dawson preferring to meet at the Edgefield Courthouse in Tillman's home county, they finally agreed upon the Globe Hotel in Augusta, Georgia, just across the river. While the meeting was an honest effort to review the issues, the fact of its occurrence, once revealed, set political rumors flying thick and fast. Many felt that the June 2nd meeting in Augusta actually shaped the Democratic Convention, which had been called for August of 1886. In truth, the two men did not arrive at anything like a combination for a slate of officers, and the men they supported, both together and separately, fared poorly. But that did not stop the Augusta Chronicle from laying the whole outcome of the convention on the doorsteps of the Globe Hotel. What they talked about on that clear night, mused the paper, no one knows, but the rumors growing out of that conference have shaped this convention and changed the personnel of the state ticket entirely. The convention and the rumored combination did have one significant effect on the future of the state. It taught Ben Tillman a lesson. In the aftermath of the much publicized combination, the Edgefield farmer wrote Dawson suggesting that it would
be advisable for you once in a while to give me or the movement a punch.
Tillman promised to
regard them as love licks,
for he had reached the conclusion
that anything like an alliance between us will kill both. That is, we can understand one another, but we must never, 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 never meet again to arrive at such an understanding.
Tillman had learned that while Dawson might speak with an independent mind, and while he might have numerous friends, the editor's journal was ultimately the organ of established interests. For an outsider to be embraced by the News and Courier meant certain death among the constituents who gave the outsider political life. Over the next year, Dawson continued to support Tillman and the separate college idea, even in the face of stiff conservative opposition organized by the powerful alumni of the South Carolina College. But Dawson was willing to stand by the maverick politician only so long as Tillman remained content to wage a limited war against the establishment. Once Tillman proved willing to move to upper limits in his struggle against the
Rattlety-Fog Mossites,
Dawson called a halt. By the end of September 1887, the News and Courier could no longer countenance the continued intemperance of its erstwhile friend, particularly when Tillman would not stop his endless charges of extravagance and corruption in the state government. In obvious exasperation, Dawson wrote,
"The government we have is not the most brilliant or the wisest in the world, but it is honest and it is safe."
By December, the editor was convinced that the Tillman movement had seriously been
weakened by want of shading and perspective in the speeches and letters of some of its leaders.
The growing alienation from Tillman forced Dawson into a reassessment of his position, and on the 3rd of December, the News and Courier joined alumni of the South Carolina College in their opposition to the separate agricultural college. Stung by Dawson's desertion and by defeat in the legislature that winter, Tillman somewhat prematurely announced his retirement in the News and Courier and told Dawson privately
that the so-called alliance between us has ended.
For his part, Dawson simply told his readers,
"There will doubtless be another farewell, and another, and another. As he has not lagged superfluous on the stage, he can with good grace permit himself to come on the scene again."
And come again he did. With the death of Thomas G. Clemson, son-in-law of John C. Calhoun, came a large bequest to establish the agricultural college. As from the beginning, the separate college was but a symbol of the broader movement, and with the renaissance of the symbol, Tillman was prepared to take the larger case to the Democratic State Convention set for May of 1888. The suddenly unretired agitator described the state government as a place where putrefaction had set in and called upon the incredulous delegates to adopt a primary system of nominations and thereby end the abuses emanating from Columbia. The News and Courier was delighted with Tillman's performance. Believing that he had been given rope in plenty to hang himself, Dawson declared,
"The best cause the world has known would be ruined by an advocate who has no sense of propriety and little self-control."
But Dawson was the man falling quickly out of step. He had only to recall the campaign which overthrew Reconstruction to detect the origins of this new rhetoric. But surely those were the tactics of revolution, or so he thought. And as Dawson counseled at the time,
a revolution must move backwards.
Tillman, however, sensed better. He knew his audience, and while he did not win on the issue of primaries, he did succeed in having the state convention call for joint debates in each congressional district. These debates would afford the agitator, he would not become a candidate himself until 1890, a chance to stalk the candidates and to keep the grievances of the farmers constantly before the public. Veterans of the Red Shirt campaign of 1876 would remember such tactics as dividing time, a strategy whereby Democrats rode into Republican rallies, heckled the speakers, and demanded to be heard. These debates also gave Tillman a chance to challenge Dawson directly. Tillman wasted little time in calling Dawson out. On the 20th of July at Hodges Depot in Abbeville County, the Edgefield farmer delighted his audience, declaring the principal villain in the conspiracy against open government to be
Some buzzard who had escaped from the market house in Charleston and got into the News and Courier office, where it was spewing its slime all over me.
Tillman realized that the time had come when there was more to be gained from Dawson's opposition than from his cooperation, and the Lion of Broad Street obligingly fell into the trap. Dawson immediately went to Greenville in hopes of confronting his defamer, who unfortunately had not been invited, and the editor had to content himself with some homily on how the people might discern between
the true reformer and the false.
In the meantime, the News and Courier issued calls for Tillman to come to Charleston, and for the farmers to abandon their errant leader in favor of the Farmers' Alliance. The paper even promised to become the organ of the Alliance in South Carolina, making the somewhat ironical claim that the Alliance had prudently shunned politics. Tillman soon answered Dawson's call, joining the statewide canvass as it moved to Charleston, with torchlights casting an eerie glow over the throng gathered in Washington Square. The various candidates presented their qualifications and were received with polite enthusiasm. The audience was clearly waiting to hear what the agricultural Moses would say, and they were not disappointed. With Dawson present, Tillman threw himself into a performance that foreshadowed the demagogue of the South's future. In the midst of cheers, laughters, and shouts of
"Let it go, Gallagher,"
he alternately abused and amused his audience. At one point, he referred to an assistant editor who, in Dawson's absence, had been carrying with the commentary on Tillman's antics. With flashing eye and snapping jaw, Tillman cried that he knew
the big buzzard was away, but now there was a little buzzard down here who wanted to spew a little slime over me.
Apart from this digression, Farmer Tillman steered clear of direct reference to Dawson and stuck to his stock indictment of state government. When asked later why he had not rebutted Tillman's speech, Dawson claimed that the visiting speaker gave no personal insult, and thus any comment on his part would have been superfluous. In fact, Dawson was quite content to let matters stand, confident that Tillman's shrill invective would be the instrument of the farmer's downfall. Dawson's confidence was unfounded, for unknown to him, the hard-fisted democracy had listened all too attentively to the political pariah from Edgefield. Not long after the August 3rd rally, petitioners were beseeching Tillman to return to Charleston to help them secure
a full, free, and fair party vote,
and put an end to
ring rule.
The News and Courier was singled out as arch-villain. Dawson was stunned. He knew there were complaints. But had he not called on the malcontents to prove malfeasance? And had they not remained silent? Had he not time and again called on them to work within the party apparatus? And had they not shown indifference by failing to attend ward meetings? Now Dawson felt justified in rebuking the petitioners for impugning the integrity of all the good and honorable men who served Charleston. It was his pet response for those who dared challenge the ruling elite. But this time, after invoking the names of the Symingtons, the Jervys, the Dibbles, the McCradys, the Lessons ad libitum, he concluded by pointing to the gravest fault of all. This time the complainers had gone outside Charleston for counsel, and not to a Hampton or Butler or Islaw or Bratton, but to a
professional agitator who is looked upon with distrust, if not aversion, by the respectable people of the whole state.
All the editor's righteous indignation was to no avail. Tillman was returning to Charleston by invitation, and under an evening sky full of heat, lightning, and distant thunder, he took his place on the steps of City Hall, beneath the famed spire of St. Michael's. Before he was finished speaking, the multitude swelled to 3,000. Again he abused them to their delight. He called them
the most errant set of cowards that ever drew the free air of heaven,
and was greeted by cheers and laughter. He prayed for mercy on their
pusillanimous souls.
And again they shouted their approval.
"You are here cringing,"
he cried.
"You are binding yourselves down in the mire because you are afraid of the newspaper down the street."
Emboldened by another round of laughter and applause, Tillman compared the editor to the
Colossus,
with one foot on Georgetown and the other on Beaufort,
while we poor petty men whose boots he ain't fit to lick are crawling under him seeking dishonored graves.
Cries of
"Trot him out!"
welled up from the crowd. A Dawson informer darted up the street to the offices of the News and Courier, where the editor was busy at work. The excited informant told Dawson that Tillman was dragging out some old charges of printing frauds and Dawson's support of the last Republican governor of South Carolina, whereupon the editor prepared to meet his accuser. He reached the outer edge of the crowd just as Tillman berated them for not having
killed an N.
Okay, you all know what I meant by N. And honestly, it is pretty telling that Tillman was a man filled with such hatred that he literally berates the crowd for not having literally committed acts of racial murder. This guy's constitution still governs South Carolina. What is it? I'm sorry, South Carolina. You deserve better. After what the blacks had done at Cane Hoy. A footnote here reads as follows. Cane Hoy was the site of a political meeting near Charleston during which a riot broke out, leaving 1 black and 4 whites dead. The riot occurred in the campaign of 1876. Honestly, Tillman, it's always this fixation with violence, this need to, just feel better than everyone else and assert yourself and that sort of shit. I get it. I'm sure what happened in 1876 was fucked up, but don't make it worse, my guy. Dawson's arrival had created a sensation, and the crowd parted to let him take a seat on the steps of City Hall to await the conclusion of Tillman's remarks. The editor was just in time to hear Tillman explain that
Dawsonism was the domination of the old, effete, aristocratic element that clings to power with the grip of the octopod.
Having done his worst, Tillman turned the platform over to Dawson, who, while not prepared, must have given the possibility of rebuttal some thought. In an obvious comment on the nature of the new politics, Dawson opened with an apology lest his voice not reach the entire crowd, for he was
not accustomed to large open-air meetings.
The editor early got a chance to display his own verbal facility when a shout rose from the audience asking,
"How about the buzzard?"
Pausing a moment to let the crowd settle, Dawson replied,
"There would not be any buzzard if there was no carrion. It is necessary to have scavengers sometimes, and though I don't like the comparison, when you put the buzzard on me, I can put the carrion on him."
All I can really say to that is, nerd alert. I mean, yeah, honestly, that had to have been the nerdiest response he could have given, and this was even before nerds were much of a thing. As the laughter died away, Dawson proceeded to the same defense of himself and the conservative regime he had used on numerous occasions. The dramatic confrontation between the old and the new was over, but its portents for the future were unsettling. The foundations of the conservative regime had been broadly shaken, and a new style of politics was about to sweep the state. The Greenville News, which had
looked for a strong debate on pending political issues,
could well ask,
what good has been done?
Conclusion. In another year, Dawson would be shot dead while trying to protect the virtue of his children's governess, and within 2 years, Tillman would be elected governor of the state. Historians have debated whether Tillman added much that was new apart from style, and the consensus is, not much. The high mark of his tenure as governor was the disenfranchisement of the black majority in South Carolina, and his later career in the United States Senate was undistinguished save for his carrying the race issue to the American people, the subject of Howard Dorgan's fine essay in Southern Demagogues. The leader of a farmer movement rooted in genuine agrarian unrest, Tillman nonetheless shunned both the Alliance and later the Populists, along with their more systematic and ideologically consistent version of what America should be. I'll be honest, that always makes me chuckle a little. Just the ideologically consistent version of what America should be. Don't expect much consistency from this monster. Having been told repeatedly by Dawson and the conservative regime that white people could not afford a difference in opinion unless the blacks take advantage of division, Tillman's chief objective and lasting contribution was to write blacks out of the Constitution of 1868, the very document that helped spawn the new democracy which swept Tillman into power. The comparison between abolitionists and Southern demagogues like Pitchfork Ben is certainly not exact, but it does afford some useful perspective. Both confronted a newly emerging democratic society in which they saw themselves as outsiders. Both recognized the role that agitation would have to play in a society where institutions were buttressed, at least in part, by the shifting fortunes of popular consensus, as opposed to stable interests alone.
They certainly sense that radicalism to succeed should be non-programmatic, that appeals to the populace would have to focus on the lowest common denominator, which invariably is a sense of shared grievance. And the strategies they employed aimed at consensus building by intensifying feelings of helplessness before those in power. Tillman saw the new day coming in South Carolina, and though born to the traditional leadership class, developed in his early career each of these facets so characteristic of the professional agitator. But what the abolitionist and the Southern demagogue shared most was the central theme of American ideological history: what to do about Black Americans. It has from the beginning been the litmus test of the American creed, the measuring rod against which we gauge our commitment to founding principles and ideology. Having cheated himself of this ideological touchstone, the Southern demagogue found himself the leader of some but not all of the people. Having chosen to exclude some, they threw into etymological imbalance the agin, or lead, and the demos, people, and in doing so gave us the classically pejorative demagogue. Pitchfork Ben Tillman and those who followed would forever remain outsiders even when they had gained access to power. Only a few like Huey Long, perhaps, or the earlier Tom Watson, might create a popular vision of the future that, if it did not embrace Black people, at least muted the principle of exclusion. The rest would be condemned to sound and fury, for they had no place in a land ideologically purchased by Thomas Jefferson and paid for in the blood of Civil War. Well, here it was at long last. The full version of the Tillman article. I don't really know what I can say that I haven't already said. Well, I guess there was that one part that was in the last couple of pages where the author said that historical consensus said that Tillman didn't add much. Maybe he didn't add much in terms of exact rhetoric, but he still strikes me as the first person to really put it into a long-lasting political program that we can still feel today. Likewise, just the tendency of building up grievances, almost just for the sake of grievances, to create a shared sense of asabiya, for lack of a better word, that group feeling that Ibn Khaldun wrote about. It just angers me. I know I don't sound angry, but believe me, I am. Oh God. One of these days I'm going to exorcise Tillman's ghost. Either that, or I'll lay the groundwork for the next guy to do it. To help me exorcise Tillman's ghost, please smash that like button and share it around to motivate other people to exorcise Tillman's ghost. Also, you can donate money if you want. Or don't. I'm not your boss. I'm just Fax 5'em. And right now, I'm signing off.